Hello and welcome to TTF's Learning Matters, a podcast where we discuss all matters related to learning. Well, we're saying learning, but it's actually gaps in learning in the wake of the long pandemic that has teachers in schools all over the world tied up in knots. What's a learning gap? I think something that we call a disparity between what a student has actually learned and what he or she is expected to learn at a particular grade. So in other words, it's the gap between the expected and the actuals in terms of learning. To discuss this with us, we have two very dynamic educators who have demonstrated remarkable leadership, of course, even much before the pandemic, but during and post the pandemic, there was some exemplary leadership because of which their respective teams not just tided over the vagaries of the pandemic, but are now making a seamless transition back to school. We're delighted to have with us Rekha Chari, Head of Elementary Curriculum and Advocacy and Outreach at Mallya Aditi International School, and Vijai Rajagopal, Director, Vidyaniketan Public School. Both of these schools are based in Bangalore. Welcome to this podcast, Rekha and Vijay.
Thank you for having both of us. I'm speaking on behalf of Rekha as well.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you for having us, Sandhya.
Now that this academic year, we've put the breaks and the interruptions behind us. What the pandemic has actually, I think, also taught us, I think in successful schools where successful learning has taken place is where learners are also adaptable and have taken responsibility for their own learning. Don't you think that is true? Have you seen that? Where there is accountability on the learner's part, there have been opportunities for that as well.
See, when you look at the variance that exists even as we speak, right, when the children have come back, like Rekha said, with almost 1 month having gone by, it's not that the entire class has either learned or not learned. You tend to see variations. Across subjects as well, right? And if you were to step back and think about why that is the case, indeed, the attitude that the learner harbors definitely has a very important role to play. If people have been responsible and have told themselves that, look, this is not the ideal situation, but yet I can't compromise the extent to which I have learned and the quality of learning that I have. Therefore, such students have indeed benefited as a result of their good practices. That I think is quite evident across the board.
Yep. So where you have learners taking more accountability, I think so. It's I think a clear case where probably we should be promoting and inculcating such qualities in our children and providing more such opportunities. What do you think we should do? In the long term. I know in the short term, I know we have to take maybe some remedial steps. You're taking it slow, you're doing various things now, and then you probably do a few more things in terms of content and all that. But I'm asking you in terms of what do you think should be our long-term approach to build resilience, in our learners or in our system, so that whatever the break, whatever the interruption, that they can come back and own their own learning and move on. What do you think?
When Vijay was speaking, Sandhya, I had these thoughts that this we address normally and in the academic parlance of this metacognitive ability to building metacognition of learning how to learn, and at no time has it become most important than now.
Absolutely.
Where there was this amazing article I read recently, and thank God for social media and Twitter, where teachers are posting and sharing so much. It just kind of sometimes validates what you're doing. And through all these difficult times, you also saw that universally people were suffering the same sufferings and were making the same progresses. And, so that was an amazing thing. But just coming back to at no time, this is the most important time, that we have to start focusing on teaching students on becoming aware of their learning styles, of encouraging those learning styles and bringing it over and over to their attention. That, things like there are certain steps to it, like what could you have done better, analysis of their own errors, and not again being that stage on the stage who's picking your mistakes or showing you your errors, but just teaching that student to look at her work, reflect upon it, and guide her own learning. I think a lot of time has to be spent very carefully and very knowingly, that whenever you are engaging with a student on about any work, whether it is an assessment or whether it's formative or assessment or for or as learning, is to constantly take that time, make that time to sit down with the student and talk her through that process of learning, and like I said, making her aware of her abilities and taking that responsibility and being prepared to learn given any situation. In terms of resilience, oh boy, this is the most resilient lot. And they've seen so much, not just online lessons, but this fear which was gripping the world, this of seeing deaths in the family, of dealing with tragedies, of losing near and dear ones, and still stepping up and coming back, being those fighters. I think they've been, and we applaud that. We make sure that we tell these students that you have really stood up and faced a lot of difficulties and returned to be those warriors, and their lives are going to be like this going ahead, ups and downs and closures and openings, and so this will be a resilient lot. So I think that metacognitive ability that we talk about is really now taking center stage. It has to be given that time.
Great points, Rekha. In terms of acknowledging what the student has gone through, and I think sharing, and I think creating the space or the time for metacognition when planning and in implementing the lesson. We're always just focusing on completing the portion of the textbook, rather than creating that space or asking that question or using a tool which could help in reflection for the student. I think that's such an important point.
It's quite interesting that Rekha has brought about the discussion about metacognition and guided learning. I feel there needs to be one more layer on top of that. Teacher empathy is paramount, right? I mean, you can help a learner figure out how he or she needs to learn, but then you also need to address the effective side of learning, and for which the teachers need to be far more empathetic, right? And it is true that children have experienced great adversity over the last 2 years, but as a part of the kind of emotional support and support that the teaching fraternity gives them, we also will have to train the students on how to channel that resilience into something that matters. Because at the end of the day, as schools, we are responsible for learning. So we will have to figure out a way in which that kind of resilience is channeled into tasks that matter with regards to learning.
I think that's such a great point. And I think again, research has amply shown that, the emotions and cognition being so closely linked. So somewhere the self-management, self-awareness and self-management, I think being two really important points for us, I think, to focus on going forward, right? I think
those that thrived because of their abilities and because probably of the support they got, they thrived through these pandemic times. And there are those that slipped through the cracks. And those were the ones we were worried about. And one has to say that teachers did put in that extra hours even after meeting these students after regular school and bringing them up. But yes, this is that cohort of students which is resilient in the sense that they guided themselves through these difficult times. And then there are those who slip through the cracks, who need more help right now, and to bring them to that point of understanding how they learn. And from, of course, like Vijay says, from a place of empathy, from a place of knowing what their challenges are, and recognizing their limitations if there are, and setting them up for successes, small achievable tasks that set them up for success, and that will have take that leap forward.
It's wonderful. I think it's really nice to the inputs that both of you have given us. I think self-regulation, as both of you are talking, being such an important aspect, as a great way to probably address learning gaps for students themselves to recognize where they are, to seek the support, and and then for them to set their own goals and move on. I mean, if that really happens, I think that's utopia.
So, Sandhya, just one more, where we were talking about how do we address learning and also look at filling the gaps. I think we're also paying attention and focus to student agency, involving them in knowing what is it that they feel they need to know, and what are their expectations having come back. Absolutely. So these are great dialogues that we have in school when we ask them what they are expecting from us teachers having come back after such a long time. And they're serious sometimes and amusing sometimes, but student agency is also extremely important now to, give them an opportunity to voice their opinions.
Student agency with initiative, I think that's something very important for us to think of.
Well, now that Rekha is talking about student agency, I shouldn't be far behind. I feel student agency should not just be about the task at hand, the curriculum, the learning outcomes. There is so much more that the children need to see by doing that it's possible by the cohort of students, right? What I mean is, when you are going to create opportunities for student agency to manifest in a way where it is beyond academics, beyond just the learning outcomes, then I think they begin to see more reason in trying to replicate it every time. Every school does that, but it does so with a minimal understanding of what is possible by their cohort of students. I feel if we are able to open up the canvas to allow for a free-ranging thinking about what is possible and what can be tasks that we give our students, I think that makes for a lot more interesting engagement. And there will be resultant learning, but if you're going to only look at the barometer and say how much of learning has happened, how much of learning has happened, that's not going to really help. You need to give it some time. You need to bring in some fun and engagement while children are at it. That's my 2 cents about student agency in the context of things.
I think great points, great ways to think about learning gaps, right? To think about it in terms of the way in terms of agency of students, in terms of allowing students to take their time, in terms of teachers bonding with students, and in terms of knowing more about your students. I think it all starts with that relationship with the student is probably the first step then in addressing gaps, if I can say that. From what it's been great talking to both of you, Vijay and Rekha. Your points and your perspectives have been so interesting. It's going to give our listeners a lot of new ideas. Thank you both so much for being a part of this podcast. Thank you all for listening to this edition of Learning Matters. To share your ideas and any comments or questions about this podcast on the TTF app, a forum for all educators to exchange ideas and learning. The Teacher Foundation will be back with another podcast shortly. Till then, stay tuned.